My name is Alex. I'm 43 years old, and for the last 5 years I've worked as a logistics manager for a shipping company in Columbus. It's a boring job, staring at spreadsheets and tracking numbers, a world away from my first career. I spent 12 years in the Army, most of it with the 75th Ranger Regiment. I've been to places and seen things that most people only get glimpses of on the news. I learned how to stay calm under pressure, how to read a situation, and how to survive. That training is the only reason I'm alive today to tell this story. I grew up in rural Ohio, in the rolling hills that bleed into Appalachia. Hunting wasn't a sport for my family. It was a tradition, a way of life passed down from my grandfather to my father, and then to me. I knew the woods better than I knew the streets of my own town. I could identify trees by their bark in the dark, and tell you the direction of the wind by the feel of it on my neck. The forest was my sanctuary, the one place where the noise of the world fell away and everything made sense. After I left the service, it became my therapy. Every November, without fail, my best friend Cal and I would take a week off for deer season. It was our ritual. Cal and I had known each other since kindergarten. We enlisted together, though he went into the infantry and I went for the Rangers. He was as steady and reliable as a man could be, a rock. He knew the woods as well as I did, and there was no one I trusted more to have my back, whether in a firefight or a deer blind. This particular year, about 3 years ago now, was a little different. Cal's nephew Brian was joining us. Brian was 22, fresh out of college with a business degree and a city boy swagger that hadn't been knocked out of him yet. He was a good kid, but he was green.
He'd been on a few hunts with Cal on their family property, but he'd never been deep in the backcountry, not the way we were planning. We were heading to a remote corner of the Wayne National Forest, a section so isolated you had to navigate a series of crumbling gravel and dirt roads for an hour just to get near it. We rented a small rustic cabin. Cabin was a generous term. It was more of a shack built in the 50s, probably by loggers. It sat at the dead end of the final dirt track, a small clearing carved out of a dense forest of oak and hickory. It had electricity from a wheezing generator and running water from a well, but no phone service, no internet, no connection to the outside world. It was perfect. That was the whole point, to disconnect. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the earthy smell of damp leaves and wood smoke. We unpacked the truck, hauling in coolers of food, our packs, and our rifles.
Cal had his trusted Winchester Model 70 in .30-06. I had my bolt-action Remington 700, also a .30-06. Brian brought a brand-new, flashy semi-automatic rifle with a huge scope, something that looked more suited for a sniper competition than for hunting in dense woods. "You planning on shooting a deer from the next county over?" Cal had joked, clapping his nephew on the back. Brian just grinned. "Go big or go home, right, Uncle Cal?" I remember smiling at that, the easy confidence of youth. There was a lightness in the air, an excitement for the week ahead. We spent the rest of the afternoon setting up, checking our gear, and sighting in our rifles at a makeshift range we paced out in the clearing. Everything felt normal. Everything felt right. The woods were quiet, peaceful. It was exactly as it should have been. That first night, after a dinner of chili and cornbread, we sat on the small porch, nursing beers and watching the last light fade from the sky. The forest came alive with the familiar sounds of evening, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of some small creature in the underbrush. But as true darkness fell, a different sound started. It was faint at first, coming from deep in the valley below us. It was a rhythmic, low-frequency sound, a deep, resonant thump, thump, thump. It was slow, methodical, like a giant, muffled drum. Brian heard it first. "What is that?" he asked, his voice a little tight. Cal and I listened, straining our ears. I'd spent thousands of nights in the woods, and I'd never heard anything quite like it. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a woodpecker. It was too deep, too powerful. The rhythm was too perfect. "Probably an oil or gas pump somewhere down in the hollow," Cal said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Sound travels funny at night in these hills." I nodded in agreement, but a seed of unease was planted. The sound didn't have the mechanical whine or clang I associated with pumps. It was more organic, more primitive. It sounded like something massive was striking a hollow log over and over again. After about 10 minutes, it stopped, and when it did, the woods fell completely silent. Not the usual quiet, but a dead, unnatural stillness. The crickets stopped chirping. The owl went silent. It was as if every living thing in the forest was holding its breath, listening. "Spooky," Brian muttered, finishing his beer in a quick gulp. "Probably just Bigfoot sending messages." He tried to laugh it off, but his eyes kept scanning the dark tree line at the edge of the clearing. We didn't talk about it much after that. We went inside, stoked the wood stove, and turned in early for our pre-dawn start. I lay in my bunk for a long time, listening to the oppressive silence outside. My ranger training had taught me to pay attention to my gut. It's a primal survival instinct, honed by evolution, and my gut was telling me that something was wrong. I tried to dismiss it as first-night jitters in a new place, but the feeling lingered, a cold knot in my stomach. The next morning we were up before the sun, the strange events of the previous night forgotten in the cold, practical reality of the hunt. We split up, agreeing to hunt different ridges and meet back at the cabin around midday. I moved slowly and quietly through the woods, my senses on high alert, reading the terrain, looking for signs. The forest felt different, though. The air was heavy, charged. I saw no squirrels, no birds, not even a chipmunk. It was unnervingly still. I was working my way down a steep, wooded ravine when I found it. The smell hit me first. The coppery, metallic tang of blood, so thick it was almost suffocating. I slowed my pace, my hand tightening on my rifle. My first thought was a poacher's dump site, but this was something else entirely. In a small clearing at the bottom of the ravine, there were 3 dead deer. They weren't shot. They were torn apart. I'm not talking about a bear or a pack of coyotes. I've seen what bears do to a carcass. It's messy, a chaotic frenzy of feeding. This was different. This was violent, but it was also precise. One doe had its entire ribcage broken and splayed open like a flower, its organs scooped out and lying in a neat pile beside it. Another, a young buck, was ripped almost in half, its spine snapped. But the third one was what truly horrified me. It was a large doe, and it had been propped up against a thick sycamore tree, its head twisted back at an impossible angle, its front legs arranged as if it were kneeling. Its abdomen was slit open from throat to pelvis, with the clean precision of a knife. But there were no knife marks. There were claw marks, deep furrows in the flesh, but they were too wide, too far apart for any known predator in North America. I felt a cold dread wash over me. This wasn't a kill for food. Very little of the meat had been eaten. This was a display, a message, a territorial marking of some kind, brutal and terrifying in its implications. I backed away slowly, my hunter's focus replaced by a soldier's threat assessment. I scanned the trees, the ridge lines, expecting to see something watching me.
But there was nothing. Just the silence and the grotesque tableau in the clearing. I didn't hunt anymore that day. I circled wide around the site and headed back to the cabin, moving fast, my head on a swivel. I met Cal on the path back. He had seen nothing, but he had felt it too, the unnatural stillness of the woods. When I told him what I had found, the color drained from his face. He was a hunter, a man who respected the natural order of predator and prey. What I described was an aberration. Brian stumbled back a little while later, pale and shaken. He hadn't seen the kill site, but he'd found tracks, massive tracks. He'd tried to take a picture with his phone, but his hands were shaking too much. He described them as being like a huge dog's, but wrong. The stride was too long, and they were pressed too deep into the earth, deeper than any bear. And in a few of the prints, he said he could see a mark that looked disturbingly like a heel. Like it was walking on two legs sometimes, he whispered, his earlier bravado completely gone. That evening, the mood in the cabin was grim. The excitement of the hunt was gone, replaced by a primal fear. We didn't sit on the porch. We locked the door, a flimsy deadbolt that suddenly felt useless, and closed the shutters on the windows. We ate in near silence, the sound of our own chewing loud in the tense quiet. As darkness fell, the sounds started again. Not the distant thumping from the night before, but something closer, much closer. It began with a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the cabin.
It was a deep, guttural rumble, filled with a menace that made the hair on my arm stand up. It wasn't a bear. A bear's growl is a warning. This was a promise. Then came the scraping. A slow, deliberate screech of something hard and sharp being dragged along the wooden siding of the cabin. It moved from one wall to the next, a methodical exploration of our shelter. Cal and I grabbed our rifles, our knuckles white. Brian was huddled in a corner trying to make himself small. "What does it want?" he whimpered. "Just stay quiet," I ordered, my voice low. I crept over to the front door, my heart pounding against my ribs. I could hear something just on the other side. A wet, sniffing sound, followed by a heavy exhalation of breath against the wood. It was smelling us, sizing us up. Then, the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, deliberately, it jiggled back and forth. My blood ran cold. A bear doesn't turn a doorknob. A coyote doesn't test a lock. This was intelligent. It was problem-solving. I aimed my rifle at the door, my finger resting on the trigger guard. Cal was covering the main window, his face a mask of grim determination. The jiggling stopped. There was a moment of silence, and then a heavy thump slammed against the door, making the whole frame shudder. It hit it again, harder this time. It was testing the defenses. My mind raced, falling back on old training. Analyze the threat, fortify the position, control the engagement. But we were in a wooden box, and whatever was outside was big, strong, and smart. I needed to see it. I had to know what we were up against. I moved silently to a small window at the back of the cabin, one that looked out toward the dense woods. The shutter was warped, leaving a small crack of space. I pressed my eye to the opening, peering into the moonlit darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then, a shadow detached itself from the tree line. It was massive. It stood on two legs, but it was hunched over, its posture all wrong. It was at least 7 feet tall, with impossibly broad shoulders and arms that were too long for its body, ending in what looked like large, clawed hands. It took a few steps into the clearing, its gait a loping, unnatural stride. Its legs were bent like a dog's, but it moved with a bipedal confidence that was deeply unsettling. As it turned its head, I saw its profile against the moonlight. A long, canine snout, pointed ears. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a suit. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. Before I could process the image, it melted back into the shadows as if it were never there. I stumbled back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. "Cal," I choked out. "There's something out there, big, on 2 legs." Cal looked at me, his eyes wide, but he nodded. He had seen the evidence. He had heard the sounds. He believed me. Brian started to sob quietly, a raw, terrified sound. The thumping on the door stopped. The scraping was gone. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a calculating silence, a hunter's silence. We waited, our rifles pointed at the 2 main entry points, the tension in the small room so thick you could taste it. Suddenly, the generator outside sputtered and died. The single bare bulb in the cabin flickered and went out, plunging us into near total darkness, with only the faint moonlight filtering through the cracks in the shutters. My stomach dropped. It had found the generator. It had cut the power. This wasn't some dumb beast lashing out in confusion. This was a coordinated, tactical move. And then all hell broke loose. There was a deafening crash as the main window exploded inward, showering the room with shattered glass. A massive, dark form lunged through the opening, a silhouette of nightmares against the pale moonlight. It landed on the floor with a heavy thud, unfolding to its full, terrifying height. It was exactly what I had glimpsed outside, but seeing it up close was 1,000 times worse. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, a horrifying fusion of man and wolf. Its body was covered in coarse, dark fur, matted with dirt and something that looked like dried blood. Its shoulders were immense, a knot of powerful muscle, tapering down to a lean torso. The arms were long, disturbingly human-like in their structure, but ending in thick, gnarled hands, with fingers tipped in 4-inch black claws. Its legs were bent backward like a canine's, powerful and digitigrade, allowing it to stand upright in a way that defied physics. But the head was the worst part. It was the elongated, nightmarish head of a wolf, with a long muzzle pulled back in a snarl, revealing rows of yellow, dagger-like teeth. And its eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They were intelligent, burning with a malevolent, hateful light. In the dimness, they seemed to have a faint, phosphorescent glow. Before we could even react to the first one, a second crash came from the back of the cabin. Another window shattered, and a second creature, slightly smaller but just as menacing, scrambled inside. We were trapped, flanked. The first creature let out a roar, a sound that was half guttural bark, half human scream. It was a sound of pure rage that shook the very foundations of the cabin and rattled my bones. My training kicked in, overriding the terror. Threat, neutralize. "Fire!" I yelled. Cal's .30-06 boomed in the confined space, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating the horrific scene. He hit the first creature square in the chest. The impact was immense. It staggered back a step, a new, dark hole appearing in its matted fur. It roared again, a sound of pain and fury this time, but it didn't go down. A high-powered rifle round to the torso, and it was still standing. My mind couldn't comprehend it. Brian was frozen. He was standing near the first broken window, his expensive rifle held loosely in his hands, his face a mask of pure, catatonic terror. The creature that Cal had shot ignored us and lunged for the easiest target. It moved with impossible speed. One of its long arms shot out and grabbed Brian by the front of his jacket. It was over in a second. With a single fluid motion, it yanked him backward through the shattered window frame. Brian let out one short, terrified scream that was cut off with a sickening, wet crunch. We heard a brief, frantic thrashing in the bushes outside, and then silence. Grief and rage surged through me, hot and blinding.
Cal let out a wordless cry of anguish for his nephew and fired again, but the creature was already gone, vanished into the night. Now we had to deal with the second one. It had used the distraction perfectly. While our attention was on Brian, it had crept along the wall, staying low. It was smart. It was using tactics. It let out a low, rumbling growl, its glowing eyes fixed on us, its head low as it circled, looking for an opening. "Back to back," I commanded Cal, my voice hoarse. We moved to the center of the room, our backs pressed together, trying to cover all angles. The cabin, our only shelter, had become a tomb. The creature feinted to the left, then to the right, testing our reactions. It was hunting us, enjoying the fear. Suddenly, there was another crash. A heavy log, one of our pieces of firewood from the porch, sailed through the last remaining window, shattering it. The first creature, the one that had taken Brian, was back. It was creating another entry point, another angle of attack. They were coordinating, hurting us. "Alex, they're too strong," Cal said, his voice strained. He was a veteran, a man who had seen combat, but this was beyond anything we could have prepared for. "Just keep firing. Aim for the head," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice.
The second creature chose that moment to charge. It came in low and fast, a blur of dark fur and teeth. I fired my Remington, the recoil slamming into my shoulder. The bullet caught it in the leg. It yelped, a high-pitched, canine sound of pain, and its leg buckled. It tumbled to the floor, but immediately began to drag itself forward with its powerful arms, its eyes still locked on me, blazing with hate. But the charge was a diversion. As I focused on the wounded one, the first, larger creature burst through the newly broken window. It was enraged. Blood was streaming from the wound in its chest, but it seemed to have no effect on its strength. It ignored me and went for Cal. It was so fast. It covered the 10 feet between the window and Cal in a single bound. Cal tried to bring his rifle around, but he was too slow. The creature swiped at him with its massive clawed hand. The sound was a sickening thud, like a sledgehammer hitting a side of beef. The claws tore through Cal's jacket and shirt, ripping deep furrows across his chest. The force of the blow lifted him off his feet and threw him across the room. He slammed into the far wall and collapsed to the floor in a heap, his rifle clattering beside him. The creature stood over him, its chest heaving, its long snout dripping saliva mixed with its own blood. It raised its hand for another, final blow. Cal was dying. I could see it in his eyes. But even then, he was a soldier. He looked past the monster looming over him and met my gaze. His face was a mess of blood and pain, but his eyes were clear. "Go, Alex," he rasped, blood bubbling on his lips. "Get out. Tell them. Tell them what happened." Then, with the last of his strength, he grabbed his rifle from the floor. He didn't try to aim. He just jammed the barrel up against the creature's face and pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The creature shrieked, a sound of pure agony, and staggered back, clutching at its head. The shot had been at point-blank range, likely blowing off half its jaw or an eye. It gave me the opening I needed. Cal had bought me my life with his own. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted for the back door, the one that had been tested earlier. I threw my shoulder against it, and the flimsy lock broke. I burst out into the cold night air and just ran. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I could hear the wounded shriek of the first creature and the enraged growls of the second one from inside the cabin. My plan was simple: survival. I couldn't go for the truck. The clearing was a kill zone. They would be expecting it. So I ran in the opposite direction, plunging into the dense, dark woods. Adrenaline coursed through my veins, numbing the pain from a dozen cuts from broken glass and branches. I could hear them coming after me. The sound of their heavy bodies crashing through the underbrush was terrifyingly close. They were faster than me, stronger. My only advantage was the terrain. I knew how to move in the woods, how to use the gullies and thickets for cover. The chase was a nightmare blur. I scrambled down ravines, clawed my way up steep hills, and pushed through thorny bushes that tore at my clothes and skin. I could hear their guttural barks and snarls behind me, sometimes seeming so close I could feel their hot breath on my neck. I risked a glance back once and saw a massive silhouette cresting a ridge behind me, its form black against the moonlit sky. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. I ran for what felt like hours. The fear of being caught, of suffering the same fate as Brian and Cal, was a physical force driving me forward. As the first hints of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, I noticed the sounds of pursuit were growing more distant. It seemed the approaching daylight was a deterrent. They were creatures of the dark, and the coming of the sun was driving them back to whatever hell they had crawled out of. By the time the sun was fully up, I was alone. The woods were silent again, but it wasn't the peaceful silence from before. It was an empty, haunted silence. I was miles from the cabin, completely lost, but I was alive. I kept moving, putting as much distance as I could between myself and that place. I was operating on pure instinct, my body battered, my mind in shock. It was late morning when I finally stumbled out of the woods and onto a gravel logging road. I was a wreck. My clothes were torn to shreds, I was covered in blood, mine, and I think some of Cal's, and I was shaking uncontrollably from exhaustion and shock. I followed the road for what felt like an eternity until I heard the rumble of an engine. A logging truck came around a bend and screeched to a halt. The driver, a big man with a gray beard, just stared at me, his eyes wide with alarm. He helped me into his cab without a word and drove me to the nearest town, which had a small sheriff's department. I sat in a cold, sterile interrogation room, wrapped in a blanket, sipping a cup of coffee that I couldn't stop spilling because of how badly my hands were shaking. I told them everything. I told 2 deputies, a young guy and a grizzled veteran, the whole story. I started with the knocking sounds, the kill site, the tracks. I described the creatures in painstaking detail, their size, their speed, their intelligence. I told them about Brian and Cal. I broke down several times, the grief and horror of it all washing over me in waves. They listened patiently, nodding and taking notes. But I could see the look in their eyes. It was a mixture of pity and disbelief. They thought I was crazy, that I was suffering from some kind of trauma-induced psychosis.
So you're saying you were attacked by werewolves? The younger deputy asked, his pen hovering over his notepad. I'm telling you what I saw, I said, my voice cracking. They were not bears. They were not men. They were something else. They sent a team out to the cabin later that day. I waited at the station. When they came back, the senior deputy, a man named Miller, sat down across from me. His face was grim. We found your friend, Mr. Cooper, he said, his voice flat. He was inside the cabin. He's deceased. The other one, the young man, we found some remains. It's not good. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The cabin is a wreck. Looks like a tornado went through it. The official finding is going to be a bear attack, a large, unusually aggressive black bear, probably rabid. We think you and your friends surprised it panicked, and it attacked. In the dark and the chaos, you started shooting, probably hit your friend by accident.
It's a tragic accident, but it happens.
I just stared at him, dumbfounded. A bear? I whispered. Did you see the door? The windows? Did you see the claw marks? A bear didn't turn the doorknob. A bear didn't cut the generator. A bear didn't throw a log through the window. People see things when they're scared, Alex, he said, using my first name now, his tone patronizingly gentle. The mind plays tricks on you in a traumatic situation. You survived a horrific animal attack. Your story is confused. It's understandable. They had an explanation for everything. The sounds were trees falling. The kill site was a pack of coyotes. My story was the babbling of a traumatized man who had accidentally shot his best friend in a panic and watched his nephew get dragged off by a bear. They were closing the book on it. It was neat, tidy, and completely wrong. I was left with no official validation, just the crushing weight of the truth and the label of a lunatic.
I was released later that day. As I was walking out of the station, numb and empty, Deputy Miller caught up to me in the hallway. He looked around to make sure no one was listening. "Look, son," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Off the record." He looked me dead in the eye, and for the first time, I didn't see pity. I saw something else. Weariness. Maybe even a hint of fear. "You're not the first person to come out of those woods with a story that doesn't make sense. We've had other hunters go missing up in that section. Found a couple of them. What was left, anyway. Officially, they're accidents. Hiker fell down a ravine. Hunter got mauled by a bear." He leaned in closer. "My granddaddy was a sheriff in this county, and his granddaddy before him. There are stories that go way back, stories about things that live in the deep woods, things you don't want to meet after dark. My advice to you? Let it lie. Don't go talking about it. People will think you're crazy.
And for God's sake, never go back there. Some places are best left alone." He clapped me on the shoulder, a heavy, final gesture, and then walked away, leaving me standing there in the hallway, the world spinning around me. He believed me. He couldn't admit it officially, but he knew. And that was almost more terrifying than the disbelief. It meant this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a known, hidden threat. That was 3 years ago. I never went back to the woods. I can't. I sold my rifles. I moved to the city, surrounded myself with concrete and streetlights, thinking the noise and the light would keep the memories at bay. But they don't. Every night I see it. I see the glowing eyes in the dark. I hear Brian's scream being cut short. I see Cal lying on the floor telling me to run. The guilt is a physical weight that I carry every single day. I survived, and they didn't. I ran. It was the tactical thing to do, the only way to survive, but it feels like cowardice. I left my friend to die. He told me to, but it doesn't make it any easier to live with. I have nightmares. I wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of that guttural roar still echoing in my ears. The sound of a dog barking too deep in the night can send me into a full-blown panic attack. I lost my job, the one I had before logistics. I couldn't focus. I couldn't be around people. I'm isolated, trapped by a truth that no one else can see. I've spent countless hours online, falling down rabbit holes of folklore and cryptozoology, reading hushed accounts from others who have seen things they can't explain. They call them dogmen, skinwalkers, werewolves. The name doesn't matter. I know what they are. They are real, and they are hunters. I know that telling this story makes me sound unhinged. I don't care anymore. The official report says my friends were killed in a tragic bear attack. But I was there. I know what happened. I'm telling this for them. For Cal, who saved my life. For Brian, who never even had a chance. Their memory deserves more than a convenient lie in a dusty file cabinet. So,
If you ever find yourself deep in the woods, far from any road, and the forest goes unnaturally silent, listen to that feeling in your gut. If you hear sounds you can't explain, don't try to rationalize them. Just leave. Get out. Because the world is older and stranger than we think. We live in our well-lit cities and tell ourselves we've conquered the wilderness, that we're the apex predators. We're wrong. There are things sleeping in the dark places, in the deep woods where the maps are blank. And you are not at the top of the food chain.